We're going to turn our attention to the book of Acts together. I'm teaching this morning. Lucas and his family are kind of gathered together for a memorial for an uncle, and so I'm stepping in this morning to teach. We're continuing our studies. I may have said Acts 20. We're actually still in Acts chapter 19 this morning. And as you're turning there, I just want to start by kind of polling the room and getting a sense of who we are and where we've come from. How many of you grew up in a Christian home? Like you were raised with Christianity? Just raise your hand. Let me just get an idea. All right, so that's a good majority of us. Now, for those of you who raised your hand to that, let me just ask another question. How many of you would say then that you just transitioned naturally and fairly easily from your parents' faith into yours? That is, kind of you aged into maturity, you kind of naturally just kept that running. They handed you the baton and there was no fumbling there. Raise your hand if that's you. Man, that's rad. That is amazing testimony. That is God's design in action. I had opportunity to be in that first camp, but unfortunately, I missed it. I grew up in a Christian home. I had wonderful parents who raised my brother and I, but I missed that handoff. Somehow when I should have noticed the baton was being handed to me, I didn't. And so by the time I was in late high school and early college, I would say I was just a Christian in name only. There wasn't really any meaningful relationship with God. But then there was this specific night between my second and third year of college where God pins me down at the fork in a road, metaphorically speaking. He says, Jason, and I remember these were the words he said, you can do it your way or you can do it my way. My way will work, yours won't. And that was just that simple. And I had to make a choice in that moment. And for many of us in the room, if we didn't do that handoff well, or if we weren't raised in a Christian home, we can look back to a specific moment in time where we had to choose. Now, some of you guys who raised your hand twice there, you've been making that choice daily for a long, long time, for as long as you can know. But others of us look back to a specific moment, a specific time where we had to choose what was being offered to us. And in Acts 19, we see that choice again. We see people making choices. The gospel is active, it's at work in Ephesus, and just as Jesus told his disciples, people couldn't remain neutral. And that same truth is active today. We can't remain neutral about the gospel. The gospel still calls us to choose, to count the cost, and to make a choice. Again, for some of you, wonderfully, you've been making that choice your whole lives, and that is such an incredible testimony. Others of us, we can think back to a specific time, a specific moment where we began to make that choice. And regardless of whatever camp we find ourselves, whatever we're at in that spectrum, we continue to choose today to follow Jesus and to give him our lives. And I think our chapter shows us those choices in action. And so let's pick up in Acts chapter 19, verse 21. We'll read through the end of the chapter together and then see how the Lord might want to speak to us. So when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a time. And about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the whole world worships. Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the whole assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hands and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And when the city clerk quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Zeus? Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering." And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we look to you today to prepare our hearts, to speak to us, to think of what was prayed in the prayer meeting beforehand, how each one of us, our lives are represented by soils, and different parts of our lives are represented by soil. Good soil that's willing to receive, thorny soil that's distracted, maybe rocky soil where things can't take root, or maybe even there's parts of our hearts that are hard and unwilling to receive anything. But Lord, we pray that you would truly prepare our hearts today, and that we would partner with you, and that we would say, Lord, we want to receive your word into our lives, and that it would go deep into who we are and settle into the very core of who we are as your people, and that it would bear fruit in our lives, and that fruit would be glory to you and be a blessing to us and the people around us. Lord, let our lives, our hearts, our minds be good soil today for your word to settle into. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, as we get started, let me just begin by reminding us where we're at, kind of in the story of the book of Acts. Paul is on his third missionary journey. And if you were to go back to verse 1, you'd see that he's come to Ephesus to set up shop. You can kind of see it there on the map. He started in Antioch, which is there on the left, kind of center right of your screen. And you can see the arrows moving from right to left, stopping there at Ephesus, which is in the coastline there of the area that we're calling Asia, or modern-day Turkey. And he's gone through the churches that he had previously planted on earlier trips, and he's strengthening them and checking in on them, and he's getting to Ephesus, which he had hoped to visit during his second missionary journey. And all of chapter 19, this whole chapter, it takes place in this one city, Ephesus. And then in chapter 20, if you were to kind of cheat and look forward there, Paul say that he was 3 years in Ephesus. Now, by comparison, his 18-month stay when he was in Corinth in his second missionary journey had been, at that point, his longest stay in any one city on these missionary journeys. So a 3-year stay in Ephesus is one of Paul's longest times in any given city during a missionary journey. And so 3 years have passed in Ephesus. It's a large city with a large population. Some would estimate around 300,000 people were in and around the city. As we read, we saw that it's the temple, or it's home to the temple of Diana. And don't think when you're thinking of this temple just kind of a local church like we have here or what we've grown up with. Rather, the temple of Diana was literally one of the 7 wonders of the world at that time. The temple was known throughout the ancient world, and people flocked to it as a site to visit, to worship, or even just to see it in its magnificence. It brought the city of Ephesus a lot of wealth, a lot of influence, and a lot of prestige. It was a powerful draw. And so as you try to imagine Paul in the text, and you're thinking through it, and you're trying to picture the scene in your mind, picture him in this large metropolitan area. The place is teeming with life and activity, all the sights and sounds that you might think of in a city full of people. That's what we're thinking of when we think of Paul. And he's been pouring out his life for the last 3 years. If you were to read his kind of synopsis of his time in Ephesus, it's found in chapter 20. And he says that he administered from house to house, that he kept back nothing to the Ephesians. Paul literally poured himself out entirely to the Ephesians. He gave them the whole counsel of God's word. He shared everything that he possibly could. He left nothing back. He describes himself as working as a tent maker to provide for himself and those who were serving alongside him. So he not only is sharing the gospel with them and teaching them from the word, he's also working with his hands to make that all possible. And Paul has worked tirelessly to see people reached with the gospel, to see lives transformed. And again, you can read more about his comments on his time in Ephesus in chapter 20, verses 18 and following. But as we've landed here in verse 21, it's now time for this season to wrap up. It's time for this 3-year investment into Ephesus. It's come to a close, and Paul is on to the next chapter of obedience. And we read that he wanted to go to Jerusalem, but we're not told why here in Acts 20. And so it takes kind of reading the rest of the New Testament together to find out in Romans 15 and 1st and 2nd Corinthians that Paul wanted to gather an offering from the Gentile churches to take back to the struggling church in Jerusalem. They were falling on hard times and difficult season, and so he said, hey, the Gentiles have benefited so much from the religious work that has come out of Jerusalem that it's our duty and our obligation to give back in ways that we can. And so he's going to try and collect this gift and deliver it to the church in Jerusalem. And he sends out Timothy and Erastus, as we read. He sends them out ahead of time to collect and prepare the gift, because when Paul comes through, he doesn't want his trip to be so much about the pennies and the accounting and all that. He wants to be able to invest in the people and not really have to worry about the financial question. You can read about that in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 to see Paul talking to the church in Corinth. They were kind of lagging behind in their diligence. And he says, guys, I just want to visit you when I get there. I don't want to have to deal with all the money stuff. Just let's get these things in order so we can be generous. And so that's Paul's heart. When he's talking about this trip through Macedonia and Achaia, which are kind of the regions of Greece, and then on to Jerusalem, that's his intent, to gather this gift and take it to Jerusalem. Now, with Timothy and Erastus gone, things are about to get a little crazy in Ephesus. I love how verse 23 starts, that there arose a great commotion about the way. This has to be one of the better understatements in the book of Acts. My kids can cause a great commotion just playing Legos. This is not that. This is so much more. This is a near riot. We read that the whole city is going to be confused. At one point, they're going to fill the theater, and that theater was capable of holding 25,000 people. And so this was not just some kind of bubbling up in the streets. This was a massive citywide conflagration of people confused and understanding what's going on. And so, yes, when Luke describes it as a great commotion, it certainly was that. And at the heart of this commotion was greed. We read in verse 24 that there was a certain man, Demetrius, a silversmith, and he and his fellow guildmates, they made these silver shrines to Diana there in the temple. Again, as we mentioned earlier, Ephesus was home to a temple dedicated to Diana. This temple, and here's kind of an artist's rendition of it, it was 450 feet long by 225 feet wide, 60 feet high. And the temple of Diana and the worship of Diana would draw people from all over the place. And like many tourists, say if you were to go to Tahoe next weekend, you could come away with any sort of reminder. You could get a sticker for the back of your car, a shirt to wear, you could put some expensive art on your walls. Whatever the case, you could buy from a cheap trinket to an expensive item. You can find these reminders to take a little bit of Tahoe home with you. And the same thing was true of Ephesus. If you visited the city and saw the temple, you could find any sort of thing from just a small trinket to an expensive item, either to just remember your trip or to take that and use it to worship with you at home. And so Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen, they made quite a bit of money by this. We see even today entire communities are supported by vacationers and people coming to visit and take a tour. And Demetrius and his friends were in that same boat. We read they made their living by selling these shrines. In fact, they made a very good living. The word prosperity in verse 25, we have our prosperity by these things. It speaks of abundance. So they're not just paying the bills. They're paying the bills and able to sock away quite a bit as well. This trade brings them financial abundance. And now, as we read earlier, they see this trade as under threat. Paul has been teaching people that there is one true living God, and he's been calling people into fellowship with that God. And as a result, we've been seeing people turn away from the worship of other things, and that includes the worship of Diana. This was happening not only in the city of Ephesus, but throughout this region. As Demetrius says, this whole area is being undermined by Paul's teaching. And so as Demetrius addresses his fellow silversmiths, he says, the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed. Isn't it kind of interesting that he uses that? With this, he seeks to add a little bit of religious credibility to his claims, a little bit of religious appeal to this. But we're not fooled by this, are we? I mean, we read through Demetrius' speech, his call of alert to his friends. Just look at how much of his speech is about the financial impact, and then how much is about the religious impact. So much more of his talk is about we make a good living by these things. Our economy is in threat. Oh, and Diana, people might not respect her anymore as well. I love how one commentary describes Demetrius saying that his religious zeal was merely a hypocritical pretext. It was just disguising his real concern, which was his bottom line, under this pretense of we care about Diana and her honor and her worship. He may have had a passing concern about Diana and the temple, but really only as it impacted his bottom line. Well, Demetrius knew his audience. He knew exactly what strings to pull in order to get a response from this crowd, and get a response he did. We read in verse 28, and when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians, and the whole city was filled with confusion. Again, he knows exactly what buttons to press in this crowd. Gang, if we don't keep things right, our profitability and our job security is under threat. They were filled with wrath, the Greek word says. In the original Greek, it speaks of this passionate, heated anger. So they're not just a little frustrated. There's this boiling over is the idea. They boil over, and that's exactly what happens. This room kind of boils over into the city around them, and their passion and their anger, it stirs up the whole city. The whole city is whipped up into this confused state, and this volatile mixture of silversmiths, as they pour into the general population, the whole city is shaken and stirred up. Now, we're not told exactly how, but this confusion, it begins to kind of coalesce into a mob that then leads into the city's theater. We're not exactly sure. Did they say, hey, everybody, we're meeting up in the theater. Let's talk about what we're going to do. We're not sure how groupthink began to take place, but everybody starts moving towards the theater. And swept up into this maelstrom were two of Paul's companions, Gaius and Aristarchus. We read that in verse 29, two of Paul's traveling companions. And it's really hard to imagine what this would have been like. This theater, as we hinted at earlier, was a massive structure. You can find pictures of it online today, this huge amphitheater just stretching up into the hillside. Don't think of just like the high school theater down the street or, the movie theater that we might go to. This was a massive affair. One of the largest in the ancient world at that time, again, capable of holding 25,000 people at one point. For comparison, Golden One Center during a Kings game can hold 17,000. So we're talking about a seriously massive structure. And again, just to get a sense of the size of this thing, and perhaps this is meaningless detail, I found it interesting. It's 660 feet in diameter, which is 40 feet longer than the long direction of the Roman Colosseum. So if you kind of are picturing these different structures in your mind, the long side of the Colosseum, it still fits within the footprint of this theater. And at this point, this massive building is full with agitated, confused, angry people. Now, when Paul sees this, verse 30, it says that he wants to go into the people. Man, Paul is built differently, right? I don't know about you guys, but when I see this mixture, my thought isn't like, sweet, what a great opportunity to preach the gospel. I'm like, is someone going to call the cops, or what's going on here? Paul's thinking to himself, and perhaps I'm just reading between the lines, when do I ever get a chance to talk to this many people at once? He actually does the same thing later in Acts chapters 21 and 22. This time he's finally in Jerusalem. He had gone up to the temple to worship and kind of complete this vow. A riot starts there, and this time it's the Jews, not the Gentiles, who are going to try and tear him from limb to limb. The Roman garrison, they step in, they rescue Paul, and they're kind of leading him away to their precinct, and he says, wait, is it okay if I talk to them real quick? And they give him the opportunity to talk to this crowd. And so Paul, this is just his thing. He sees this large group of people. He doesn't care. They're ready to tear him limb from limb. He says, this is a great opportunity to share Jesus with some people who really need to hear the gospel. Paul is built differently. He's built for this. Now, thankfully, for Paul's health, he has some friends who try to pump the brakes a little bit. They try to temper his zeal with a wee bit of wisdom. We see that some of his travel companions, the disciples would not allow him to. It seems almost literally restraining him. And we read that there's these officials of Asia in verse 31 who were his friends, and they send word pleading with Paul, don't go in there. That powder keg is just about to blow, and if you go in there, Paul, that's going to set this thing aflame. This whole place, if it's not already in a riot, is going to go up in flames. Don't go there. Now, as a side note, these officials of Asia, they kind of give us a neat insight into the reach of the gospel that was taking place through Paul's ministry. These officials of Asia were powerful, influential individuals. Now, listen to how the Pulpit Commentary series describes these individuals. The Asiarchs, that's really the word used to describe them, were 10 in number, were officers annually chosen from all the cities of proconsular Asia to preside over all sacred rites and to provide at their own expense the public games in honor of the gods and of the deity of the emperor. This necessitated their being men of high rank and great wealth. We have here another striking proof of the enormous influence of Paul's preaching in Asia, that some of these very officers who were chosen to preside over the sacred rites of the gods and to advance their honor by public games were now on Paul's side. 10 people from this whole region. So these are 10 powerful, influential individuals who are out of their own pockets sponsoring kind of the local games, have been influenced by the gospel. God has reached them. And it's this great reminder that the gospel, the good news of salvation through Jesus, it's for all people at all places. As you think back to the biblical records of Jesus' time on earth, we see he was just as comfortable reaching his hand to touch a leper, who was the kind of the off-scouring and the dismissed individual in society, broken and cast out, as he was talking to someone like Nicodemus, who was an influential teacher who had influence over the whole nation, someone like Joseph of Arimathea, who was incredibly wealthy. And you see this vast spectrum that Jesus and the good news of salvation wasn't just for one slice or the other, but for anyone. And what we're being reminded here, that there's no one too low or too dismissed by society to be seen by God, who isn't seen by him and observed by them. And there's no one too wealthy that God is saying, well, you don't need my help. You have it all put together yourself. Wherever we're at in that spectrum, God sees us and he knows us, and the gospel is there for us. No one is beneath God's love. No one is above God's love. And so I want to just throw that out there to rest in what that might mean for us, because we might be in one of those two camps saying, look, I've really got it together. I don't really have a whole lot of need in life. And the gospel would say, look, you still need a Savior. Or maybe we're on the other side. We say, I'm so broken. I'm so kind of dismissed by society. If society dismisses me, then certainly God doesn't want anything to be. And that's absolutely not the case. Wherever we're at, we need to let that truth settle into who we are. And then, as we own that, we need to have that approach to the world around us, don't we? Because we can't go out into the world and say, oh man, the gospel isn't for that person. They're too well off. They're doing all right. They don't need the gospel. Or, oh man, I'm not going to talk to that person. They're kind of beneath me. We need to be those people that, like Jesus, are willing to touch those who have been dismissed by everyone else and unafraid to talk to those who are wealthy and powerful and think that they might have it all put together. I love this reach of the gospel, these 10 Asiarchs, these powerful, powerful individuals, and yet the gospel is reaching their lives as well. So, verse 31, while clear thinking is kind of prevailing outside the theater, we read in verse 32 that confusion and emotion are winning the day inside the theater. Verse 32 perfectly captures the scene. It says, therefore some cried out one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. I love that. Perhaps 25,000 people, will say, up to 25,000 people there, and most of them have no idea why they're here. They just know this was the hot place to be. They probably saw kind of like this stream of people running towards the theater, and like we have the propensity to do, they said, well, they must know what's going on. We're going to follow those guys. Wherever they're going, something must be happening. And this momentum and this gravity begins to form behind the crowd, and they all show up together. Whatever was happening, they didn't want to miss it. Now, among the crowd there's this Jewish contingent. And they somehow pieced together, even though there's confusion reading, they've pieced together enough of the information to make certain that they don't want to be blamed for any of this. They realize that somehow this guy Paul's there. There's somehow these lines being drawn between the worship of Diana and maybe a threat to that. And they're saying, look, we're monotheists. Paul is preaching one God and a derivative of the Old Testament. We don't want them to think we're part of this too. And so they put together a plan, hey, we're going to kind of create this distance between us and Paul. They want to make certain that even though there might be some similarities between them and Paul, they are not on the same team. Listen to how commentator Adam Clark sets up the scene. He says, from this and the following verses, it's pretty evident that this Alexander was brought forward on this occasion by the Jews, that he might make an oration to the multitude in order to exculpate the Jews. That is, to excuse them and to kind of exonerate them, who were often by the heathens confounded with the Christians, and cast the whole blame of the uproar upon Paul and his party. There does not seem any just ground from the text to suppose that this Alexander was a Christian, or that he was about to make an apology or a defense for the Christians. And so the Jews, they put forward Alexander, probably not to defend Paul and his gang, but to say, hey, don't confuse us with Paul. We've got no beef with what you guys are doing. Interestingly, as you're kind of comparing your New Testament, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul mentions in Alexander the coppersmith, saying that Alexander had done him much harm. And it's possible that this Alexander here in our text is the Alexander that he mentions in 2 Timothy 4. And perhaps because of his trade as a coppersmith, that there's enough common ground with those who had started the riot, the silversmiths, that he's able to say, hey, look, we're kind of on the same page. I can speak your language. Perhaps there's enough common ground that the Ephesians would hear him and not sweep up the Jews in their desire to move against Paul. Now, we don't know for certain. That's just us connecting some dots, but it does seem to fit. However, in any case, it doesn't actually matter that much. Before Alexander can say anything, we read in verse 33 that they drew him out of the multitude. The Jews put him forward. He starts waving his hands to try and get the attention of the audience. But we read in verse 34, but when they found out he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." When they discover he's Jewish and therefore not a worshiper of Diana, this sends the theater back into a frenzy. And for 2 hours they chant, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Just 2 hours non-stop. And remember, most of these people don't even know why they're there. right? Most of these guys aren't heavily invested in this. They're just there, and everybody else is chanting this, and so they're going to go along with it too. There's this collective mania taking place in the theater. The people are just caught up in the emotion, the hype, the social current that can move a crowd. And as we move into verse 35 through the end of the chapter, some point in this, that somehow the city clerk is able to finally quiet the crowd and get their attention. Maybe they just tire of yelling and chanting. If you've ever been a part of the wave at a sporting event, right? Somehow some bright spark gets that thing going and it just makes its way around the stadium and then it just kind of peters out, right? It just kind of loses its own momentum. And maybe that's what's happening here. After 2 hours of yelling, they're kind of like, why are we still yelling this? Does anybody know why we're doing this? And I don't know. It's just conjecture on my part. I'm trying to picture myself in the scene. Who knows how they are quieted, but at some point we learn the city clerk is able to quiet the crowd and speak to them. He gets the attention of the multitude, and using the amazing natural acoustics of the amphitheater, this theater seating, he's addressed the entire multitude. Amazingly, and I think beneath the current here, it's God moving beneath the current of these events to quiet them and protect Paul and the work that's happening there. Again, there's ability for the city clerk to actually reason with them. At no point in this conversation have they been reasonable individuals, and now, again, I just attribute it to God kind of moving the think of the crowd. The clerk is able to reason with them, and as we read through it earlier, you realize there's nothing earth-shattering about his speech, is there? He basically tells the folks, gang, you need to calm down. You need to chill out. He says, Paul isn't out here to try and get you. He's not trying to undermine your living or attack the temple. Just chill. And he says, look, if Paul was up to no good, there are legal ways to handle that. If Paul's really trying to cause problems, we've got courts, we've got proconsuls, we've got legal precedent for these things. And then he just dismisses the crowd, as simple as that. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you go from this massive thing with 25,000 people in an uproar, this boiling over, this wrath, and then the crowd just scatters and dismisses. It's kind of a supernatural move of God to dismiss the crowd. But within his speech, and I just want to draw attention to this briefly, we have an interesting insight into Paul's preaching. When he says that he's neither a blasphemer nor a robber of temples, what we have here is the idea saying that Paul didn't so much preach against something, against Diana or the temple, as he did preach towards Christ. And I think there's a distinction there worth making, because as believers, we can be really noted for what we're against. We're against this social standing. We're against these issues. We're against these sins. And the world around us more knows who we are for what we're against and less for who we are, who we're towards. And Paul wasn't there saying, hey, this temple's got to go. That wasn't the main message. As he pointed people towards Jesus, they realized, man, I've found the one true living God. I don't need this Diana thing anymore. I don't need to go to that temple anymore. And it had the effect of shutting down the temple, or could have. And again, we need to have that same type of attitude mark us, that we're more known for what we're towards, that is, we're towards Jesus. We're trying to call people towards him than what we are against. Paul was not so much against Diana as he was trying to draw people towards Jesus. I really love this idea. Again, the authors behind the pulpit commentaries put it this way. It appears also that St. Paul had not launched into abuse of the heathen gods in general, or Diana in particular, but had preached the more excellent way by faith in Jesus Christ to draw them from their idols. A more excellent way. Now, I don't like to build a study on the back of the quotes of others, but let me just quote the pulpit commentary one more time, because they capture this idea so beautifully. What sweet lessons of godliness, what glorious promises of immortality, what captivating revelations of the goodness and love of God did that gospel contain. It could set men free from sin. It could raise them to fellowship with angels. It could give them victory over the very grave. But when Demetrius heard, he saw in it one fatal blot which obliterated all its excellences. It would destroy the trade in silver shrines. One fatal flaw which obliterated all its excellences. It would destroy the trade in silver shrines. And this gets at a powerful challenge and a lesson from Acts chapter 19. Like we opened with, the gospel requires us to make a choice. It demands that we count the cost. God offers us so much through the gospel, just like that pulpit commentary series was saying. We have all these wonderful things given to us through the gospel. But he also says, you and I need to count the cost. The gospel isn't just a get-out-of-jail-free card. The gospel is a call for us to lay down our lives and to follow Jesus as Lord. Following Jesus means making him Lord of our lives. He's not simply a nice addition to make us more well-rounded people. Like I volunteer at this club, I help out at this school, and I happen to have Jesus on my side. That's not what it's intended to be. In each of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this demand of Jesus is plainly stated. In Mark chapter 8, verse 34, it says, when Jesus had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then Jesus builds on those words saying, for whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Jesus invites all of us to follow him. Like we talked about earlier, from the most broken in society to the most powerful individual in society, Jesus invites all of us to follow him, to find in him forgiveness of sin, the promise of heaven, and life more abundant now. He promises to wipe away the guilt and stain of sin. He promises to break those chains and change us and make us new people. He offers the promise and person of his Holy Spirit, and then he presents us with a choice, a value judgment that you and I have to make. Are these things, is Jesus himself worthy of us losing our lives in order to gain him and what he promises us? We have to make that judgment call for ourselves. He promises us all these things. And he says, but you're going to need to lay down your life in order to pick these things up. You can't have your hands full of this stuff and still grab hold of me. You can't have your heart still filled with the love of this world and then have it still filled with love for me. Jesus invites us into that decision. And it's a decision you and I have to make all the time. Now, wonderfully, in Ephesus, we've seen many who are willing to make that choice. Right now, we're focusing on the folks who aren't. But if we were to rewind a little bit in our chapter, we've seen that many have already made that value judgment. Remember what happened in the verses just preceding our section. In verse 18, we read, and many who believed came confessing and telling their deeds. Also, many who had practiced magic brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted up the value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. So this message of salvation through Jesus was changing lives radically in Ephesus. We're seeing there in verses 18 and 19 radical transformation taking. People realizing what I have in Jesus is worth much more than what I ever give up. And they say, I can't keep these things in my life and still follow Jesus in a wholehearted way. I'm just going to burn these things. And they did so at great cost to themselves. It wasn't like they were just getting rid of I've been meaning to clean up that room in the house anyways. Let's just burn that stuff. These were things that had been precious to them, that had defined them. And now they say, I'm going to give it up freely, even though it cost them greatly to do so. They were willing to count the cost. Now, sadly, our section that we're reading this morning shows us people who remained unchanged. That when they considered the cost, it was too much for them. Remember, Demetrius and the gang is saying, we have our prosperity by this. We have our living by this. And it's not worth giving up that living to follow Jesus. They heard what Paul was teaching, but Jesus wasn't worth it to them. They preferred to keep what they had in this world. And just think about it. They're doing this math in their head. They're thinking all these worshipers and tourists who come into town, they're not going to stop by our shops anymore. If I close up shop, I'm not going to have the kind of the respect that people are looking around and saying, oh, look, kind of nudging their spouse or the family. Look, isn't this thing beautiful? And the silversmith kind of taking the pride in his work, like, that's my work they're talking about. And I know that they're going to pay it because it's valuable to them, but I know the profit that that's making. I know my artwork and my handiwork is going out in the world around me, and I know there's homes all over the place. As he would talk to folks, where are you guys from? Where are you guys visiting from? And it had mentioned some place, and you realize, that's my artwork is going to their place in this distance. That sense of pride and that sense of profit that was coming from these things. And if Paul's preaching really resulted in the diminishing of Diana's worship, people would no longer need Demetrius and his fellow silversmiths for this type of work. And as they make the calculations in their mind, it seems like too much to them. It's not worth following Jesus to give up what they have in hand. Now, I want to be careful because we can't simply shake our heads at these guys and think, why didn't they see it? Instead, we need to ask, where are we at in the chapter? Where are we at in Acts chapter 19? Are we among that first group who are willing to surrender everything to Jesus? Or are we standing there with the silversmiths, still holding on parts of our lives, unwilling to surrender? And if we're honest with ourselves, we're probably a blend of both. There's areas of our lives that we are happy and willing to surrender, and then there's other areas of our lives that we are unwilling to let Jesus touch. We're like Achan in the book of Joshua, among the Lord's people, a part of the Lord's army, and yet still hiding things that the Lord has asked us to surrender. I'd suggest that each one of us, myself included, has portions of our lives, whether small or great, that are too precious for us to yield. That we're unwilling to say, Jesus, I'm going to surrender this part to you. You've been pointing to this and saying, Jason, you need to give that up. You need to let that change. You need to bring this under obedience to me. And I'm saying, Lord, but if I do that, that means... And I have some justification in my mind where I say, but you can't have it right now. How do we overcome that? How do we move from that camp into the place where we're like the earlier Ephesians who are saying, I don't care what it costs, 50,000 in silver, put it there in the fire. It's all his. He's worth so much more than that. How do we move from Demetrius and his group into that earlier group? How do we rebalance the scales in our mind as we weigh God on the one hand and our treasure on the other? I think the answer is found in Ephesians chapter 3. As Paul's going to write back to these people later in the book of Acts, or later as Acts concludes, he prays for the Ephesians. It's a familiar prayer, I'm sure, to you. He prays that Christ would dwell in their hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. I believe it was, at least in part, this overwhelming love of God demonstrated through Jesus that stirred the Ephesians to this willingness to change. And I think it's the same thing that works in our hearts. The Ephesians saw before them a love that was greater than anything, bigger than all of creation put together. And that love called them to respond. They saw that what they gave up was nothing compared to what they received in exchange. And gang, this is how we rebalance the scales in our mind. When God, by his Holy Spirit, is putting his finger on something in your life, whether it's small or great, this is how we rebalance the scales and say, Lord, you're worth it. It's when we get a glimpse of his love for us and who he is. This is how we gain the strength to lay down more of our lives to Jesus. Those things that seem too precious to us, they begin to lose their luster, their value, when we see God more clearly and we understand more deeply his love for us. Again, we all have these areas of rebellion in our lives, areas where we say, like Demetrius, following Jesus, it's going to mean giving this up, and that idea scares me, and I'm not sure I really want to give that up right now. Again, perhaps God is even bringing a couple of things to mind. And the way to deal with these things isn't ultimately through an increase of self-discipline. Like I've got 12 steps I'm going to follow to greater surrender and self-sacrifice. The Old Testament is littered with examples of God's people saying, we are done with sin. We're not doing that anymore. We're going to give up these things that seem precious to us. 2 chapters later, they're back at it, right? In Exodus, perfect example. 10 Commandments comes down. They hear it all thundered from the mountain. God is literally up there in the smoke. And they say, yep, we agree to all of that. Moses goes up there to get the written copy. What do down at the base? They're building the idol, right? That's what we do. That is human nature. That's not just them, that's us. And so it's not through our greater self-discipline that we're able to say, yes, I'm going to do better because I'm bootstrap myself up into greater spirituality. It's as we see God more clearly, as we understand his love more deeply, and as he's free to work in us by his Holy Spirit, the scales are rebalanced in our minds, that we say, this thing was costly to me. It was precious to me. But Lord, you're better than that. What you're offering me is so much better than what I'm trying to hold on to for myself. Again, we don't deal with these things through greater self-discipline. It's rather through a greater awareness of who God is, a deeper sense of conviction of his love for us. It's when we catch a glimpse of God like Isaiah did, or when Paul's prayer for the Ephesians is answered in our lives, when we finally see a little bit more clearly the width and length and depth and height of God's love, that we move more and more away from Demetrius and closer to Paul, who would say, what things were gained to me, these I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things lost for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. And I count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. That's how it's done. And gang, we need to respond to this. A person like Demetrius cannot simply be a tragic biblical character to us. He needs to be a call to respond. We can't read about a man like this who dismissed what Jesus was offering and not see ourselves reflected in his image. God wants to use someone like Demetrius to draw us closer to himself. Those idols, those shrines, they only serve to hurt Demetrius, and the idols and shrines that we have in our own lives, they only keep us from God and his best for us. You know, as I was preparing for this morning, I had to stop so many times in my notes to make sure that this wasn't just something I could put down on paper that I could give to someone else and not let it impact my own life. I had to regularly pause and see this was something that God was speaking to me. I need to search my heart just as much as you need to search yours. I need to lay down my life and pick up the cross that he has for me. And my fear for us as a church is that we could just go through the motions on a Sunday morning. We could hear God's call and invitation for greater intimacy through surrender and just leave unchanged. Like, hey, good study, interesting details. Did you know 25,000 people? And that's the thing that we take away, and we miss God's invitation to greater intimacy with him through surrender. And we would leave here unchanged. You know, another fear of mine in this study is that some of us, or perhaps even all of us, would be content to have surrendered what we have. That we look at our lives and say, man, I've given up so much for Jesus. Look what I've done. My life has changed. And we stop there. We're content at that point. And we're able to ignore the Holy Spirit as he says, but there's more. Don't stop there. Press into a deeper knowledge of who God is. Draw more into what he has for you. Don't be content at that spot. Some of us will look at what we've surrendered already and think, it's enough. Because we can maybe find someone else to say, I've given up more than that person, so I'm doing good, right? And we'll stop there. And we won't listen to the Spirit saying, but you can come closer. I have more love to show you. I have greater things to lead you in and greater stuff for you to be a part of. We ignore the quiet voice of the Spirit calling us to surrender more of what holds us back because we've already given up so much for Jesus, and isn't that enough? Gang, we can't be content. We can't ignore the choice that God sets before us. We need to see him more clearly and to follow him into greater intimacy. You know, we're going to wrap up here, and we're going to transition into communion. I'll have the worship team come up, and we're going to spend some time just kind of pausing on this thought for a bit. But isn't communion a wonderful opportunity to pause, to remember what Jesus has done, and to ask God to help us see him more clearly, to understand more fully the extent of his love for us? And as we're holding the reminders of Jesus' body and his blood, what a great reminder of God's love for us. Because there is no greater demonstration of the love of God than the work of the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. No greater love has a man than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. And as you're holding the communion elements this morning, and as we're singing, I encourage you to say, God, would you help me to understand what is the height and width and depth, the extent of your love, with the fullness of who you are, dwell in my life, and push out those things that I'm unwilling to give away at this moment. It's an opportunity for us to give him more of our lives, to set more of who we are down at his feet. Let's not miss this opportunity. If you haven't grabbed the communion elements during our song, they're out in the lobby. If as we'll sing the song together, and then I'll come back up and lead us in communion. But if as we're singing, you want to pray, I'll be over here. There'll be folks over here to pray with you. But let's not miss this opportunity to respond and say, Lord, like David, search me. Help me to see how much closer I can draw to you if I would just give up this or that. Let's not pass by this opportunity. Let's pray together. Father, we're thankful that the invitation to surrender isn't something done to our harm. I know the idea of surrender, of giving things that are precious, it can seem scary. It can seem a bit frightening. That what if I give up this, then what? I mean, Demetrius had a reasonable fear. If I give up this worship of Diana, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to take care of my bills? And there was a reasonable fear, but you already knew the answer to that. And every fear that we have as we are called to surrender, you've already answered it in one way or another. Lord, help us not out of fear or stubbornness refuse the call to greater intimacy with you this morning. Help us see what that looks like. Help us be in more awe of who you are as we sit with the elements of communion. Consider what Jesus has done for us, Lord. We want to really let these things sink deep into who we are and be transformed by your Spirit from the inside out. In Jesus' name, amen. As we worship, you can feel free to stand if you want to. If you want to sit and kind of ponder things, if you want to meditate for a bit, feel free to stay seated. But let's not just go through the motions as we're closing. Let's be deliberate about this moment together.